And this is a very special meeting as we're celebrating, as we've said several times, the 45th anniversary of a remarkable organization and the 40th anniversary of a remarkable individual. Jan Barris's dedication, hard work, commitment, and attention to detail has really helped the National Committee become what it is today, a splendid institution. And whether it's picnics for Chinese friends in Washington, D.C., or the fund, the Young Leaders Forum, or the luncheon for the premier, or the dinner for the Chinese president, or housing visiting Chinese students, or accompanying delegates going to China, leading them around, or receiving them here, Jan makes it happen on time, within budget, and with a smile. And Jan, we love you. We love you for all you do and for all you've done. And as Schopenhauer said, the first 40 years of an endeavor give us the text. The second 40 give us the commentary on it. So tonight, we're going to have a bit of commentary. And I would say that tonight is an occasion to celebrate the past with that commentary and to build for the future. As you came in, you each got a card. It's a pledge card because we've decided to launch the Jan Barris Program Fund tonight. And this is simply a pledge. So as you go home and you think about all the things that you could do that would really help the National Committee, put this on your list. But if you can make a pledge tonight, there will be staff standing at the door, just so anxious to get your warm comments. Now I'm going to start the commentary with a letter from, I believe, our second president, Art Rosen, who wishes that he could be here, but he sent us this letter. And it starts out, on a stopover in Hong Kong in 1971, a Foreign Service colleague took me to a lucky party. And that was my first encounter with a multitasker, long before the term entered our lexicon. This young woman was running from living room to kitchen, back, hastily flipping flapjacks while keeping up the conversation on the run. We met briefly a year or two later when she was assigned to USIA in Washington to arrange the activities of the first Chinese delegation to the United States since the founding of the PRC, the Chinese table tennis team. But for me, the real excitement began in January of 1975. I had taken early retirement from the Foreign Service to join the National Committee, and when I arrived, wow, there was Jan. She had been given a temporary leave from USIA to help manage a tour for our first delegation of American university presidents to China. For most neophytes, it would have been an almost frightening experience, but she returned delighted with the experience and was able subsequently to draw on their goodwill and esteem to arrange programs for our visiting Chinese delegations at their institutions. The U.S.-China relations did not run smoothly in those days, with the Cultural Revolution sputtering along. Jan always remained unflappable and continued to build strong relationships with the leaders and members of delegations on both sides. Before long, Chinese officials and diplomats began to call her Jan, or Xiao Bai, rather than the more formal Bai Xiao Jiao. I got it right, Jan? You'll get the letter. As for Jan's dedication to the job, many of you know of her 70 to 80-hour work weeks. If not out of the office on National Committee business, she can usually be found at her desk working until chased out at night by the watchman. In our old offices at the UN Plaza, I once found her asleep on the office couch when I arrived at 8 a.m. And there were so many 70-hour weeks when she sat at her desk eating canned tuna fish for dinner before walking home at night, and I would open the office door in the morning at 8 a.m. to find her asleep on the couch, and there were times where the watchman made her leave before he could lock up the building. How long can she keep it up? Work with me on this. Bai Xiao Jiao, Wai Sui. Which means 100 years of life for Jan. Signed, Art Rosen. And now we will invite others to speak better Chinese than I.
Richard.
Let me pick up some of the points I made earlier, and let me just say to whoever is controlling the video, I pulled out of my files a couple of photographs, and I didn't have a chance to coordinate the cueing of these pictures. So I'll say to whoever hopefully is controlling the video that I'll indicate when it's appropriate to show the two pictures. I, as I indicated earlier, began my teaching career at Michigan in the late summer of '66. And three things happened right out the bat that were two of them were absolutely terrifying. One turned out to be terrific. The first terrifying thing was I walked into Lane Hall and there was my name painted on a door. I had absolutely no preparation for a teaching career. So it was all research. At MIT, we didn't have teaching assistants, and so it was rather terrifying. The second was to walk to my first class, and they had given me a room with about 70, that hold about 70, and I'd hear, as I walked down the hall approaching the room, I could hear this big buzz. I walked into the room, there were over 150 students there. Because of the turmoil on the campus, everyone had come to learn how Chairman Mao was making revolution, and they wanted me to tell them how to tear the place up. I'm not kidding. This is not about me, so I won't give you some anecdotes. But the third thing that was a joy was when I opened that door with my name painted on it, there was a young lady inside, Jan Barris. And Jan turned out to be not just a terrific, she was my first graduate student, but someone who really we took into our family. And if they'll show the first picture, maybe it'll turn up, but the point was that Jan showed such maturity that I deputized her to teach the next generation of China specialists. And what you see there is Jan, who became the babysitter for Lisa Solomon, my eldest daughter, and Lisa was holding the next generation there. And so Jan and I began what has been a lifelong association. Now, we just heard how Jan went on from her training at Michigan to, in part, enter the Foreign Service and work for USIA. And somewhere along the line, I convinced her that working for the National Committee made a lot of sense. And at that point, I was on Kissinger's staff working with Winston and others, and I particularly was a liaison to two important committees that were set up to handle exchanges. They were known as the AC-DC committees. The AC committee was Ann's committee. Ann Heatley then was running the Committee on Scholarly Communication with China out of the National Academy of Sciences. And DC was Doug's committee, but we quickly learned that it was Jan who was involved there. And Jan, as was mentioned, began her very successful career as an operator of exchanges, which we know was not part of the initial National Committee agenda, by running the ping pong tour. And so now they got to cue up the second photograph. And there was Jan. not really playing ping pong, but her head is on the body of Zhuang Zedong. And Winston will remember this. This was the June 72 trip to China, and the Chinese pitted Winston and me against Zhuang Zedong and the number 2 player. These are the number 1 and 2 players in the world, and I said, forget that. So I said, let's play mixed doubles. So I got Zhuang Zedong, who was number 1. Winston's a much better ping pong player than I was. And Win had, I forget the name of the number 2. But Jan was behind the scenes, organizing the ping pong tour. And in that particular photograph, if you look at the table behind there's John Negroponte, who was on the tour then. You'll recognize John with long black hair, which he doesn't have. And Henry Kissinger is right behind Solomon there. You can't see him. But Jan, again, played an absolutely critical role and has continued for, as we've indicated, more than 40 years. Jan, it's been a great ride and it ain't over yet.
Doug. Well, I've learned in recent years not to speak unscripted for more than about 30 seconds. So I prepared some remarks, which in fact are going to prove that there was no coordination between us, certainly not between me and Art Rosen. You're going to hear a lot of the same words. This is the advent of Jan. It's not easy to speak about a dear friend of 40 years who has become a national treasure, or to strike a proper balance between toast and roast. So I'll just review some basic facts about Jan's arrival and early days at the National Committee. In 1970, when I joined as program director, the committee's small office in the UN Church Center building on 44th Street was a pleasant, purposeful, but fairly quiet place. Public attitudes about Red China had been softening a bit, and some visionary board members, as Dick says, thought it could be useful to start thinking about what if civil communication actually became possible? And so in January 1971, a dozen or so China specialists from academia, government, and NGOs met for 2 days here in New York for an off-the-record seminar on the prospects for U.S.-China relations. If I recall correctly, they concluded that some kind of opening with China was conceivable, but that no one could sensibly judge the prospects. A few months later, American ping pong players were on top of the Great Wall. President Nixon announced his plan to visit Beijing, and suddenly the committee became an exciting, frenzied place as we rushed to prepare for the return visit of the Chinese team. The most urgent need was staff expansion. And thanks to the recommendation of well-connected committee members, I soon had the privilege of hiring 2 truly amazing women. One of them, years later, agreed to marry me, for which I am eternally grateful. By that time, Jan was already married to the National Committee, for which we all are eternally grateful. Jan, I'm embarrassed to say that my memories of your actual arrival are dim, and I had to resort to board meeting minutes to recall the details. But even the minutes made no reference. However, I did come across a memo to the membership from Chairman Alex Eckstein at your Michigan alma mater, dated August 25, 1971, that reported Miss Jan Barris, a graduate of Michigan's Far East Studies program, who has just returned from 2 years as Assistant Cultural Attaché with the USIA in Hong Kong, will serve as a program associate. And a program summary a week or 2 later, said on September 9, 1971, Miss Jan Barris joined the staff. 9/9/71. Don't forget that date. A date that will live in fame. It was soon clear we had made a really great choice. A smart, vivacious, energetic staffer devoted to the cause. But who then could have known that we had hired an actual force of nature? A workaholic sustained by minimal sleep and an occasional can of tuna fish, Art Rosen, who simultaneously monitored TV news, wrote memos, and juggled multiple phone calls with her famous last words, "I'll call you right back." Nothing's changed. It took barely a year to recognize Jan as a world-class multitasker, who are at least consistent. And we were eager to exploit those talents. Amidst the ping-pong hubbub, Jan was put in charge of many things, many of which she may not remember. Media programs, backstopping Don Klein, a China scholar at Tufts, who had been hired as a consultant to cultivate the press, particularly the UN press corps and those who would accompany President Nixon to China. 2, programs for special constituencies was the word. By cooperating with AC, Ann's committee, to help educate the scientific and medical communities, and helping Arne de Keyser, our field staff coordinator at universities around the country, to arrange briefings for corporations and trade-related organizations. Conferences and publications, such as Mike Oxenberg's imaginative and controversial book project on lessons from China's developmental experience, and producing a newsletter called Notes from the National Committee, which persists to this day. Number 4, information resources. Jan was charged with creating a speakers bureau and compiling a list of American visitors to China as resources for the lecture and media circuits. And on top of all that, ping pong itself, doing whatever was needed to prepare for the expected reciprocal Chinese visit, and in April of '72, joining the traveling party across the U.S. as cultural counselor and interlocutor for the Chinese and Americans. That experience resulted in the first of Jan's many intense love affairs with whole delegations. Ping pong was soon followed by acrobats, then gymnasts, journalists, etc., each of which for Jan was more wonderful or delightful than the last. Jan's passion for working with Chinese delegations and Beijing hosts seemed only to grow. But within about 2 years of her arrival, a problem began to surface, as I think Dick mentioned. As the board minutes put it, there were, quote, possible areas of tension between the exchange program and the committee's efforts to encourage objective, non-political education about China and U.S. China relations. After months of debate, the board concluded that our comparative advantage was on the exchanges side, which warranted the lion's share of our efforts and resources. As an important reason for that decision was, we already had Jan. If you have Babe Ruth or Joe DiMaggio, you don't play basketball. In those early years, we had to deal with only a handful of visits each way, 2, 3, maybe 4. At first, it was relatively easy for Jan to transfer her affections from one beloved delegation or host agency to another. But it became overwhelming. We had 10, 12, maybe 15 exchanges a year. And though long gone from the staff, I was hearing some complaints from Jan. Politics and the infamous flag incidents kept getting in the way. Not every delegation or Chinese, American or Chinese, was great. We don't have enough staff. I knew Jan had stressed out when she was furious that a Chinese delegation member asked her to find some good pornographic movies. It was so out of character. For them, for her. Among Jan's greatest contributions to the committee has been her mentoring of the ever-changing program staff. I'm told it wasn't always easy to work for a force of nature. But over the years, I've met many former committee staffers who said that working with Jan was the best training they ever had. Almost. And I believe it, because I was a beneficiary, too. Early on, Jan developed an invaluable administrative technique. It was vertical filing. That's what she says. I admit to having occasionally used the office floor as temporary sorting space. But Jan took it to new heights, literally. The leaning towers of Berris became and are an office fixture. Okay, now I'm going to get Jan annoyed with me. We're here to celebrate her long and faithful service, but we now can ask, what's next? I have no idea, but I have a hope. As is well known to present and past members of the board, Jan has written or compiled a richly detailed program report, warts and all, for almost every board meeting. My fervent hope, and Jan won't forgive me for saying this publicly, though I've said it often privately, is that before or after she decides to sit back and smell the roses, she'll draw on this treasure trove of U.S. China history and her incomparable memory to write for the public record. But for the moment, Jan still seems to be having far too much fun to make time for such a project. But dear Jan, history demands it. It can't possibly be any more embarrassing than WikiLeaks. Meanwhile, thank you for making the committee the great success it is. God bless Wan Sui, 你的朋友遍天下.
Okay, we have Mike last.
Oh, we want to do, we have Mike's video. Yes.
Oh, right. I wonder.
Sorry, we do have Mike's
I'm
video.
doing this in chronological order.
Yes, chronological to.
Sorry, I didn't do it. I was thinking.
I wish I could be there with all of you this evening to celebrate Jan Barris' still young career. Given her legendary work ethic, however, I knew she would understand why some hard duty in northern Italy would prevent me from being there this evening. Even so, she almost had it figured out how I could be in northern Italy on the 20th, there with you on the 23rd of May, and back in northern Italy at work on the 24th. Arguably, no organization in the history of U.S.-China relations has made as much difference over such a protracted time as the National Committee on United States-China Relations. And I think it's unarguable that no one in the history of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations has made as much difference to the committee as Jan. Jan literally knows more Chinese who are alive today than any other American in the relationship. Jan has literally been the network portal of the bilateral relationship. Moreover, Jan has been a Parris Island drill sergeant, training nearly 2 generations of interns and program associates. The survivors of her training have gone on to make their own marks in the relationship in fields as varied as business, government, academe, NGOs, international organizations, and journalism. Jan has been a teacher with enormous impact. And finally, Jan already has left a legacy of public education about China that is enormous. I always was surprised during my years at the National Committee that Jan seemed to be genuinely shy, and I know that will surprise many people, but shy about speaking to public audiences in a sustained analytic way. But when she did so, she's always been terrific and left a lasting impact, whether on national television or to those in the audience in person. Similarly, most people may not know it, but she's taken nearly verbatim notes of almost every meeting she has ever been in since the early 1970s. This is an enormous, irreplaceable documentary history of the U.S.-China relationship. These almost cliche-like observations, however, are not the essence of Jan. I would like to recount an incident that I trust will not embarrass her. Some years back, Jan had a health issue. She underwent hospitalization, a fact that I announced to our colleagues one day with a lump in my throat. Jan came through the procedure with her indomitable will. I was so joyful that I wanted to send a limousine to the hospital to pick her up. She immediately began to argue with me and said she would make other arrangements and it would be too costly to send a limo. I finally caved in and she indeed found a way home. A flower delivery man was hapless enough to come by her hospital room as she was checking out. Instead of leaving the flowers, Jan asked the gentleman to pick up the multitudes of flowers she'd already received, carry those flowers and the ones he had brought back to his vehicle. Then the delivery man delivered all of them, that is the flowers, Jan and her mother, back to Jan's apartment. They rode home in a delivery van, as I recall. In this incident, we see what has made Jan so phenomenally successful. First, it's no accident that her room was full of flowers. People love her. Secondly, Jan is absolutely fearless in asking for what the committee needs to be successful. And third, physical comfort, exhaustion, and convenience have never entered Jan's calculations about herself. And finally, Jan did it to save money. In short, presidents of the National Committee come and go, but Jan endures. America and the world are far better places for her dedication, leadership, and love. In the course of this day, please know that I am celebrating this very special woman with you. She's a network for the relationship, a teacher, a public communicator, and above all, a human being from whom we all should endeavor to emulate. Thank you, Jan, and thank you all.
John.
Thanks, Steve. You know, I knew there was going to be not much left to say about Jan after hearing these encomia. You know, Jan, I had lunch yesterday with some friends in Minneapolis, and they were talking about a friend of theirs who has just turned 104 and had been advised by her friends to stop playing tennis. So she's taken up the bicycle and what else was it? Kayaking, yes. So 40 years from now, more or less, I expect you to be doing something similar. You know, I don't want to talk about your achievements and what you've done for the committee. I'd really like to talk about what Mike just did, which is your person, who you are, your character, and your qualities as a human being. And I think first of your intellectual curiosity and your intellectual honesty. You want to understand things. You want to understand China and its people. And you have a tenacious desire to help Americans and Chinese know and like one another. You know, you're a romantic idealist. Rarely does the world come close to matching your hopes. So while you inevitably conclude that this or that government or institution falls well short of its proclaimed ideals, and you find plenty of failings in individuals, myself and yourself included, you have a huge heart with room for lots of people that you trust, admire, like, and love. You have faith in individual people. When Jan concludes that someone is good and meritorious, well, they are. You have room to accommodate their foibles and mistakes. Jan put up with me for nearly 7 years. Jan is passionate about people and is loyal to her friends. This is, in fact, a huge problem for the National Committee. Jan has so many friends that after worrying about what gift to buy for a birthday or wedding, she actually has little time left for National Committee work nowadays. My biggest mistake as her boss was not providing her with as many secretaries as Hank Greenberg has. I think he has 4 or 5 who could have taken some of that burden off of her. Jan is a loving daughter and sister. It's fun to see her mother and brother here today to witness this tribute to her. My hat's off to you, Mrs. Berris, for raising a wonderful daughter. Jan is a wonderful and complicated person. She's Whitmanesque. And she is the hardest taskmaster of any tour guide on earth. There were surprisingly more people didn't die of exhaustion on the tour she led to China. I was on one of them. Is Jan a perfectionist? Does she shy away from, this is a rhetorical question, does she shy away from instructing New York taxi drivers what route they should take? Does she know how to use semicolons in a list? I learned that from you, you remember? The committee, of course, has benefited from her attention to detail. This is a term that Carla used earlier. Obsessive attention to detail, sick attention to detail. No, I don't know. I've edited this a little bit. As we were developing the Young Leaders Forum, her thoroughness exhausted the patience of one of our board members. Ned isn't here today, I don't think, who was helping us select the initial forum members. He stopped coming to the meetings. But it was your careful vetting of YLFers that played such a huge role in its eventual success. Jan, you should know that your 40 years of dedication to the committee and its cause of promoting constructive engagement with China have borne fruit beyond anyone's expectations. You have influenced directly the lives of thousands of people and indirectly millions upon millions more. Here's to you.
Well, Mrs. Berris, Billy, when I joined the committee, 6 years ago, Jan was already a legend. In many ways, I looked at her as the Forrest Gump of U.S.-China relations, present at every major event since ping-pong diplomacy. I'd known her for 25 years, but I really hadn't worked with Jan, except for speaking to a few visiting delegations many years ago. I wondered what it would be like to not only work closely with this legend, but to actually supervise her. From day one, it would be, as the Chinese would put it, like the lips and the teeth. It was only a few months into my tenure when I went with Jan to Zhou on a Young Leaders Forum, and I got my first glance into what a multi-talented person this was. At the end of the Young Leaders Forum, there was this fierce competition between the Chinese young leaders and the American young leaders singing against each other. And suddenly, and I'm not kidding, this was a real significant competition. But then silence when Jan breaks into, "I'm just a girl who can't sing." First she does it in English, and then she does it in Hebrew. What I didn't know at that time, what I learned very quickly, is that when it came to the relationship, "I'm just the girl who can't say no" was her modus operandi. No task is beyond Jan. No effort is too great. The extraordinary for us mortals is the ordinary for Jan. When I'm with a delegation at 3 p.m. in China, and my phone doesn't ring asking me if lunch was good enough and is everybody on the bus, I worry, because where's Jan? It's 3 a.m. She's not calling me. People always ask, why don't we have a Beijing office? The answer is easy. We have Jan, and she's available all around the clock. Those of you who visited my office know that there's a couch in my office, and I generally tell people not to sit in it, because it's really not a very comfortable couch. Just sit on the chairs. So they say, well, why do I keep that couch? Because it's a great couch to sleep on. And so many mornings, as Art said, and as Jan is asleep on that couch when I come in. And I quietly walk in and I go about my business, trying not to wake her, knowing that she's only slept for a few hours. The Chinese always ask, we have this incredible output from the National Committee. They ask, how many people work there?
Yeah, right.
The answer is, not 15. They say, well, it can't be. Well, they haven't figured that Jan counts for another 15. Jan has this predilection for the 3 a.m. train to Washington, D.C. because she can walk from our office over to Penn Station, about a 12-minute walk. Then she takes the train down, gets a full night's sleep for her on the train, and then has a full day in D.C. The one thing I need to ask you, Jan, is either to take me off speed dial or to get a new cell phone, because the number of times I've gotten a call and heard her steps or a muffled sound from being in her purse, I cannot recount. We've heard about Jan not wanting to waste money. I think And the committee runs very tightly, as we all know. But if Jan had her way, I think we would never spend any money. She has the uncanny ability to marshal pro bono support like no one I've ever seen. She takes the axiom, waste not, want not, to new levels. We have stacks of recycled paper in our office dating from delegations that visited us in the 1970s. During meetings in my office, she regularly visits my trash bin to make sure I am properly recycling. Her devotion to the committee and protection of its brand are amazing. When I was in China a couple of weeks ago, accompanying this congressional delegation that I talked about in the members' meeting, a story appeared in the Chinese press about the congressman that didn't mention the National Committee. Instantaneously, every BlackBerry in the delegation lit up with a message from Jan. You can bet that for the rest of the trip, this omission was the first thing that the delegation mentioned in any meeting, each with a nod to me and a message that I should make sure to tell Jan. The staff had a vote. I think John mentioned Jan's dedication to perfection. The staff voted. The most used phrase in the office is Jan saying, "Let me see that before it goes out." Let me close with just a few words from the heart. You know, a lot of people, I think after I joined the committee, after a career in business, people have been surprised I've stayed at the committee for 6 years. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of the primary reasons is every single day looking forward to seeing and talking with, and yes, sometimes even supervising Jan. Her quirky habits, her dedication, her commitment, her humor, her desire for perfection, and her love of this organization make her a joy to work with. So I'm thrilled we can honor you today.
You get a rebuttal?
At the very end, she has rebuttal. Let me turn to Jean Barnett. I'm going to have some people from the audience and then others from the audience. We have microphones on each side. If you would just get up and make your comment, please, because time is very short. Try to keep your comments to no more than 2 minutes.
That's impossible, so I'm just going to throw my speech away. But anyway, it's marvelous to be here. And as the other Barnett, and you might not know me very well, but I know some of you, and as I said, it's just perfectly swell to be here with you, Jan. I have a long speech. It's more than 2 minutes, so I'm just going to read the last paragraph, and I'm going to give you the rest. Because Jan and I'm an outsider. Jan and my relationship with Jan is a personal experience. All the things that we've done together over the 30 years, from ping pong to acrobats to leading the women's delegation in China, in which we went to Disneyland and had terrific fun going around on go-karts and having hysterical times. And more recently, of course, her support for the Barnett Oxenberg lectures, where Carla spoke last year. Unfortunately, I wasn't there. To more recently in Shanghai, where we just had fun together going out. So I'll just read the last paragraph of what I've had to say here. If Steve, Mike, John, Art, and Doug, back to the beginning, have served with distinction as the head of the committee, Jan, as they most surely have, I've always felt you to be its beating heart, as well as the imaginative center with all of your impressive smarts, long enough to reach out and collect in your inimitable way people of all manners, persuasions, and cultures, particularly, of course, Chinese Americans, sort of a lodestar around which we all naturally have clustered, and doing so have become not only friends of you, Jan, but of each other. so important and rewarding, at least for me. I expect a number of us here count Jan's ever-expanding birthday picnic, which began years and years ago, now an institution, as something all of us in Washington would absolutely never miss. And you wouldn't believe it, but astonishingly, it never rains. And for me, this day is a happy opportunity to bow to someone I can say I love and admire without reservation, and how honored I am to be able to say it publicly. There just ain't anyone like you, Jan.
Ellie? No? Ezra?
The first time I really got to know Jan was when the ping pong team suddenly showed up in the United States and she needed interpreters. And we haven't trained interpreters in this country to prepare. Nobody was prepared. And my job as a young faculty at Harvard was to go around among the graduate students, see who we could find and turn up who could possibly do interpretation. And I turned up people like Tommy Gold, who's here today, and Perry Link, and Doug Spellman. And one other person I turned up, I understand, is going to send a message, and that's a person named June May. June May was an extraordinary person. She had been a carpenter. She had started medical school. She had studied Qing history. And she could talk economics with the Economist. And she is just one of those multi-brilliant people who knew about everything. And somehow Jan was on the phone with me continuously. She wanted to know everything about all these people. And in her usual attention to detail, but also her enthusiasm. And it's been my pleasure to be part of that enthusiasm for all these 40 years. The latest one was with these young pips in China. And again, Jan was not only the multitasker who was there on the phone to New York while we were while the bus stopped and we were waiting for the driver, but she was there and she conceived the program. She's not only a natural enthusiast who loves everybody and who is related as a person. I think one of the great things is that her job fit her so well. I mean, all her natural talents of loving people, of bridging cultures between China and the United States, as well as being on task. All these were evident in these visits with these young talent. And I must say, I think the PIP is one of the greatest programs we've gotten going to broaden our intellectuals so we'll have another generation of people like the Doak Barnetts and the Lucian Pies who have broad interest in China. And I've become such a convert that I've talked the Japanese into setting a PIP program, and I've talked the Koreans into setting up their PIP program, and it's all because of Jan. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
I skip Bob Daly. But then Bob after that.
For the last 30 years, during my more than 65 working trips to China, I've been constantly surrounded by China experts, Chinese China experts, American and European China experts. Of all the China-related organizations that I've worked with, there's only one that has as part of its being a remarkable woman, one who speaks excellent Mandarin, who understands her Chinese counterparts, remembers all her Chinese colleagues' names, and whose presence in a room at a meeting always gives me the feeling of having someone special there who has the long-term skill and knowledge to take charge thoughtfully at any time. It's sort of like having my blue blanket with me. I salute Jan Barris, our sui generis friend and colleague, and everyone's blue blanket.
We have Bob. I skipped Bob. Let's see.
Hi, I'm Carol Hamrin. I first met Jan the summer of '79, that exciting summer in Beijing when American celebrities were tripping over each other to come to China for the first time. And I was working in the newly opened embassy under Stape Roy and Ambassador Woodcock, trying to prepare for Vice President Mondale's visit. I had been studying China from afar for 10 years from before the Nixon visit, but never been to China until 1978, the year before, when I got more than enough of the factory briefing and the commune briefing. But Jan introduced me to the fine art of VIP banqueting as she led a delegation, the first delegation of U.S. mayors to travel through China. And I had the privilege of going along with her, and Liz Perry was the academic expert. And I brought with me a few pictures. That trip hasn't shown up yet. And I have a picture of Jan with two ponytails that we used to call dog ears that hasn't shown up. So if any of you want to see those. Well, as I watched Jan and observed her and learned from her on that 10-day trip, I think, yeah, it was a long one and all over China. And I was amazed, like the rest of you, at her ability to herd cats. And I was really impressed the way she handled sensitive issues. We had several incidents of racism that offended a couple of the African American mayors, which were very delicate. And, you know, the more I reflect on what was really my first orientation to China through Jan, I realized how many people have learned from her about China who never had a chance to do an academic study of China. And so what they know about China is what they learned from Jan, traveling with Jan in China. So I would guess she's probably educated thousands of people, more than most professors in universities have an opportunity to influence. So on behalf of all those people, Jan, thank you for investing your time, your energy in this wonderful life work.
My name is John Riley. I ran the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations for many years. In the early winter of 1966, several months before the National Committee was launched, Doak Barnett, Bob Scalapino, and Lucian Pye made a request to Vice President Hubert Humphrey for a meeting. I happened to be the foreign policy assistant to the Vice President at that time. Doak had briefed the Vice President on several occasions before on China, and he suspected that perhaps he was uneasy with the rigid policy of Dean Rusk and Lyndon Johnson at that time, who still believed that Ho Chi Minh was a direct agent of a monolithic communism based in Moscow and Beijing. So when the three professors came in, the question they put to Vice President Humphrey: has the time arrived when it is timely to start an effort to try to educate both the leadership of the current and future governments as well as the population of the United States, looking toward a time when relations with China would become normalized and would resume. The National Committee, of course, was launched a few months later, and one of the singular contributions I noted and would like to credit Jan Barris for was the activities of the National Committee right from the beginning were not limited to the usual suspects in New York, Cambridge, and Washington. But a special effort was made to include both people and institutions from around the country, and that included Chicago. I was privileged to be among those who accompanied Cyrus Vance to Beijing in 1975, very distinguished delegation. And in those years and later years, Jan would be the one who would take the leadership when delegations from China came to the United
To
States.
apologize, excuse me, I have to apologize. We actually have a
Yeah,
lot
I'll
of people
finish.
who signed up, and it's 2 minutes, and it's already
I'll
far beyond
I'll
2
finish.
minutes.
30 seconds, okay?
No,
I'll finish. Fine.
please.
Yeah, fine.
No.
So I just want to credit Jan with a very singular contribution of making sure that the country at large was included in the activities of the National Committee, both with visits coming both ways. Thank you very much, Jan, for that great contribution.
Let me apologize and just say that a lot of people have signed up in advance to speak at this event, and I have a list here which I'm trying to follow. So can I encourage people to let me go through the list first before they stand up and take the microphone? Also, to keep the comments to 2 minutes, because many more people want to speak than we have time for.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Daly, and I met Jan first in 1987 when I was a junior officer trainee at the American Embassy in Beijing working for Ambassador Lord. And I begin to hear, after being there for a few months, whisperings in the hallway that Jan Barris was coming. And this was very mysterious. It was clear that much was meant by this. An old friend was returning. A three-ring circus was going to be putting down stakes in a small town. But there was a bit of an aura of menace as well. Rumors maybe of an invading army. I didn't understand what this was about, but I knew that it meant something. And I forget the details of that first visit, but I came to understand in the mid-90s when I had the great good fortune of traveling with Jan in China as an interpreter, also in the United States. And I remember especially a group of national minorities leaders that we took to reservations out west into Hawaii. And a day in Hawaii that was endless. We hit 2 islands. We went to a luau. We had 3 or 4 meetings, and the group was exhausted. I was exhausted from interpreting, but was also very glad to find somebody who could out-Chinese the Chinese in terms of exhausting itineraries. And at the very end of the day, when the group was ready to go home, Jan said, no, we're going to one more place. We're going to go see this guy. His name is Drew Gladney. He's a surfer. He lives by the ocean. You must go to his house. And the group pulled me aside and said, we're exhausted. We don't really want to go. And I said, Jan, they're exhausted. They don't want to go. She said, they're going. So we went. And it was a great meeting. Drew brought in a leader of the Hawaii independence movement. But it was an exhausting day. And at the end of the day, I went back to the hotel and I was going to debrief with Jan. I was ready to turn in. Jan was doing a crossword puzzle in front of CNN in her room. It was one of the most tiring and glorious days in my China career. And you taught me a great deal, Jan. One of the things that you've taught to everybody is that this matters, and not a moment is to be wasted when we have a chance to get together. You also taught everyone, I think, that it's about building networks. Certainly wonderful to meet Drew and the many people in this room that I've met through you. And again, you teach, I think, what a pleasure and a privilege it is for all of us to be involved in this great work. You continue to be an inspiration. Thank you.
Steve, it probably took me 30 seconds to get up here, so trust you'll give me 2.5 minutes. As I was listening to what everybody has said, the only thing I could think of really to say is ditto. But my wife said, well, just if you want to say something to the crowd, just tell them that Jan still has all those outfits hanging in her closet. Many of them need to go out for dry cleaning. And she probably needs some assistance, and I think her brother Billy and her mother will be helping her move those clothes out pretty quickly. There's a saying in my family, it's reached sort of the level of being a maxim, although we know that not all maxims are actually true. In this case, it is. And we say, emulate the work style, the work ethic of Jan Barris, but not the work style. And I think that a lot of the speakers today have alluded to that. Let me close by saying that I never thought that I would mention Schopenhauer as well as Carla Hills did. But Schopenhauer did say, we must have read the same book of aphorisms, Schopenhauer did say that there is something in all of us that is wiser than our heads, and that's our hearts. And I think that Jan certainly has one of the biggest hearts of all of us. And John Huntsman just wanted me to say that as he noted at the Barnett-Oxenberg speech, that in tribute to your husband and to Mike Oxenberg, that some people have the audacity to see the potential in a relationship and not to see its limitations. And you, Jan, I think certainly can be characterized in the same way. Thank you.
So I have the honor tonight of reading on behalf of June May, mentioned earlier. June's association with the National Committee goes back to 1974 when she began working as an escort interpreter for visiting Chinese delegations, and she joined the staff in '83 and stayed through 1986. And she wrote, on the third stop of their U.S. tour in Minneapolis, the Chinese Performing Arts Company got word that PBS was going to film their performance for later broadcast. One of the solo dancers came to June and asked anxiously whether there would be any close-up shots of her. June writes, I explained that usually several cameras were used, including some for close-ups, and while the final footage would be chosen by the director, it was entirely possible that some close-ups might be included. The dancer declared that she could not be filmed unless we got her something to make her teeth whiter on camera, as she felt they tended to look yellow up close. She also said that it should be easy to find the whitener used for this purpose. Jan and I therefore went off to a theatrical supplies store, and at first the task seemed easy enough. We explained what we needed to the salesman, and he immediately said, sure, tooth paint, we have that. What color do you want? White, of course, we said, wondering why he even bothered to ask. No, you can't just say white. Do you want cream, ivory, snow, or some other shade of white? Of course, we had no idea, so the ever-intrepid Jan asked if it would be possible to try some samples. The salesman obliged, and Jan put a dab of tooth paint on one front tooth. After looking at the mirror, she decided it was too unnaturally white and tried a second sample on another tooth. This went on several times before we found a shade which seemed about right. As we were getting ready to pay, Jan started to wipe the paint off her teeth, at which point she discovered that it wouldn't come off. Jan asked the salesman how to get it off, and he said, tooth paint isn't supposed to come off easily. It has to stay on throughout a performance. Just leave it on and brush normally. It'll come off after a few days. The problem was that Jan's front teeth were now all in multiple shades of white, and for the next couple of days she had to speak in a mumbling fashion and try her very best not to smile at anyone. Fortunately, the tooth paint did eventually come off, and now we have our smiling Jan back.
Terry Louts.
Terry Louts, I'm very happy to be with you for this special occasion, and it was a real challenge to think of what to say about Jan, having known her for 34 years. And this is under the category of travels with Jan, and the first thing that came into my head was a few years ago when we were with a group of these young public intellectuals, American scholars in Wenzhou in China, and it was a Saturday night, and we were at a resort area, and we decided that it was time for a foot massage. And so we took these young, just two of them, and Jan and I, next door to a foot massage establishment, but learned there was a little bit more than that. And so I decided against that story because it just seemed a little embarrassing. So then I remembered an occasion when Jan was coming with my wife Ellen and I to a wedding over in New Jersey. And we ran into traffic, and it got later and later, and Jan was still in her office clothes, needed to change into her wedding dress. Somehow, and I have no idea really how this happened because I was driving, she was able to reach into through a cubby into the trunk of the car and get her little case and change into her wedding dress. Her dress for the wedding, she looked lovely. But then I decided that story was kind of inappropriate. And so finally I recalled another trip when we were driving back from Vermont. And again, Ellen and Jan and I decided to, this goes back to something Steve was saying, we started singing American musicals. And we went through everything, Oklahoma and South Pacific and King and I, and Jan and Ellen especially knew all of the lyrics and all the melodies. But what really bowled me over was when Jan came out with Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. And so, Jan, thank you for your love of life and your love of music and your love of people. L'chaim and Mazel Tov.
Ken Lieberthal.
Ken Lieberthal. What are you laughing for already, Jack? Terry, actually, we didn't coordinate this, but Terry teed up my remarks perfectly because I want to talk about the impact Jan had on U.S.-China relations via Jewish geography. Okay? Now, Jewish geography usually refers to the fact, for example, once I moved to University of Michigan 14 years after I met Jan, the guy who became my best friend at the University of Michigan turns out went to Hebrew school with Jan. I mean, that's normally Jewish geography. That's not what I'm talking about here. In 1976, Jan and I were on the same Congressional Committee staff delegation to China. The first night we were there was the night of the Tangshan earthquake. We had to leave Beijing and head south. When we headed south by train, we realized that that train was going to pass through Kaifeng. Kaifeng, the oldest, well-described Jewish community in China. Jan, of course, decided that as a religious obligation, she and I had to disembark in Kaifeng. The problem is that in those days, this is still Cultural Revolution era, the Chinese didn't let foreigners just disembark anywhere they wanted to. But we learned that the train was going to make a 2-minute rest stop there at 3 a.m. in the morning. So we went to the car attendant, a man by the name of Wang, and we decided we had to butter him up. Jan's idea was we don't butter him up by calling him Lao Wang. We butter him up during the Cultural Revolution by calling him Wang Lao, right? The venerable Wang. We did that. This man melted. We were special friends. We got to Kaifeng at 3 a.m. He woke us right before we got there. We got off the train for 2 minutes, stood on the platform, got back on, having fulfilled our religious obligations. Now the question is, what was the impact on U.S.-China relations? Right? My guess is some combination of the following. That American imperialists are flatterers? Absolutely. Wang Lao. That American imperialists are determined? We could not be stopped. That American imperialists somehow had a secret underground cell in Kaifeng? Who knows? That American imperialists are very hard to fathom, indubitably. Jan, you have been consistent all your life in developing creative solutions to building bridges, as everyone has said. I want to join with everyone else in just saying you've changed my life for the better, and love you dearly.
Lee?
I joined the National Committee in spring 2005, and I left 2 years ago, so my tenure there was all too short. However, by all accounts, it was a few intensive years, and in the sense that it's like belonging to a family, with crises, drama, and triumphs. But also in the sense that it never fails to amaze me how intensely productive an organization with such a tiny staff could manage to be. Congratulations, Jan, on your 40 years of living, working, and breathing the National Committee. I loved working with you now and then, and learned so much from you from the very first day. The staff of the National Committee knows that on your first day, Jan will give you a history lesson of the committee. Of course, those history was riveting, colorful, and glorious. However, that was April 2005, and I was about to fly to Beijing with my very first delegation. And after 3 days, and we barely scratched the surface of 1979, and had to ask, when do we ever get to 1990s? Of course, those early conversations were valuable lessons. While I was working for National Committee, I typically go to Beijing 3 or 4 times, and 2 phrases opened door for me consistently, and they are the ping-pong diplomacy and Bai Li Juan, beautiful jasmine, which is Jan's name in Chinese. well, from the highest level of diplomacy and statecraft to the minutiae of always having a hot water kettle at the ready for Chinese delegation member who require hot water and tea. You left an indelible mark on the U.S.-China exchanges, and we all learn from you, and I'm very honored to be your colleague and friend.
Ann Thurston.
I'm Ann Thurston. And the first thing I want to say, Jan, is you look absolutely great. And your lipstick is still on. And I remember the first time I met you, and I can't exactly put the precise day to it, but it was sometime in late January or early February 1979, and it was at the East Building of the National Gallery of Art, and it was the visit of Deng Xiaoping, and the National Committee was hosting a reception for us and Deng Xiaoping. And you look spectacular that night, too. I also have lots and lots of funny stories to tell about Jan, but I think that that's not what I want to do today. I want to tell you about what for me was my most special encounter with Jan. I've often, when introducing myself to groups, described myself as the China counterpart to the narrator in Iris Murdoch's novel, The Philosopher's Pupil, who says, my role in life is listening to people's stories. And my role in life has been sort of listening to Chinese people's stories. But for a few years, and thanks to Jay Henderson, who is here tonight, I was also given the opportunity to listen to the stories of Americans who had had a special relationship, had had a significant impact on U.S.-China relations. And there are many people in this room today who I interviewed as part of that program, but Jan was one of them. And I just wanted to share with you a few thoughts about that interview that I had, and her mother was there for that interview too. I remember that as well. I have to say the interview, I reread it again last night. It's over 100 pages long. Part of it gives me goosepimples, part of it makes me laugh, and some of it makes me cry. The part that gives me goosepimples, I think, is when you tell the story of how you went from being obsessed with everything Hawaiian, and somehow were advised as a teenager that maybe you could broaden your horizons to other parts of the world like Asia, how you met Dick Solomon and worked as his research assistant, how you just tumbled into this test for the Foreign Service and became a member of the Foreign Service, how somehow you were seconded for 1 year, then 2 years, then 3 years, then 4 years from the Foreign Service to the National Committee, and now it's 40 years. And it was just a lovely, heartwarming story about how in the world you sort of tumbled into this work that you've done for the last 40 years. Oh dear, my 2 minutes are up. Oh dear. Okay. Well, I will share the rest of this with you later. But I do want the point that I want to make here is that you have a marvelous, marvelous life. You have a marvelous story to tell. I don't want the minutes of the board meeting. I want your story, and you really do have an obligation to write your memoirs. Thanks, Jan.
Nick Lardy, and I'll be very brief. I haven't traveled with Jan, but unlike some of you, I lived on the West Coast for 12 years, so my remarks are just a very quick testament to her hard work and her endeavor. The practice in our household was almost always my wife answered the phone, but on the West Coast, when the phone rang at 11 o'clock, she would always say, "It's Jan, you answer it." And she always asked me, doesn't Jan ever sleep? And as we've heard from so many people, she's been working around the clock for the National Committee for 40 years, and thank you for it. Thank you.
Mary Bullock.
Oh, I just can't help but smile looking at Jan and her mother here. Jan, I don't know if you tweet or if you text or if you have a face page. I'm pretty sure that you don't have a blog because I know you don't have time to do a blog. But I think all the conversation we've heard tonight illustrates how Jan really invented social networking for the U.S.-China community. And I think you did it using old-fashioned technology. The two examples I will give, one Nick was just talking about, was the telephone. Some of you may remember an occasion, and well, I don't know, it was 10 years ago, in which you were given a special gift from the National Committee at the big gala banquet, and it was a cell phone. It was the first cell phone I think I had ever seen. It was very cumbersome and clunky. Everyone cheered because it was such a natural gift for Jan. I won't tell any other telephone stories, but the other old-fashioned technology you used was mentioned by, where's Jean? Oh, right in front of me was Jean, and that were your Washington picnics. Now, I can't think of anybody but Jan Barris who would give herself a birthday party, invite the famous and the not so famous, and ask them to bring their own food on what I remember is cold, windy days, or a lot of mosquitoes, and really created a community across academics and journalists, business people, Chinese diplomats. Another part of that community were the generations of families. And my kids, at least, think that China policy was made at your picnics. And that's what they remember today. Now, one other comment on the networks. There may be some real monetary value in Jan's social networks. This is a true story. I was interviewed about a month ago by Steve's McKinsey group, who are trying to find some new ways for the National Committee to have long-term secure funding. And as the conversation went on, they finally said, the key question here is not how do we clone Jan Barris, it was how do we market Jan Barris. So stay tuned, everybody. We don't have that report yet. Jan, we love you.
Margot Landman on behalf of Sharon Woodcock.
Sharon Woodcock being the widow of Leonard Woodcock, the first head of the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing. I am so sorry that I cannot join all of you as you celebrate, in quotation marks, Jan Barris moments. She has created and promoted so many important positive interactions between Chinese and American peoples of all levels. Her contributions have been really extraordinary. I owe her a special thank you for suggesting in 1977 that Leonard be considered for the role of Chief of Mission to negotiate normalization between our two countries. Would we have met otherwise? As you may recall, while Leonard was officially in China, we made an effort to meet with every group from the U.S. that visited. Whenever Jan accompanied a group, we knew that they would be well behaved and educated on the subjects that brought them across the Pacific. Everyone at the U.S. Liaison Office and later the embassy looked forward to her visits. I suspect the same is still true based on what I saw during our January 2009 trip. A hug to Jan, please.
But being with Jan, traveling with Jan, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to tell you this story because Jan, as you know, is Jewish. Now, I don't know how many of you people have been to kosher Chinese restaurants. Well, we were stopped off near Rumchi, Xinjiang on the way out, and there was a banquet being given. Jan disappeared into the kitchen. A little while later, she came out, sat down, and our whole table had a kosher Chinese dinner. It was absolutely wonderful how she can do this in a Chinese kitchen. And if your next career, if you want to start a Jewish kosher Chinese, you can do it. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about other aspects of Jan because she's wonderful. She's enthusiastic about everything. I remember another time we were sitting in our house in Sagaponack, Long Island, and we were talking about going to Tibet. Jan whips out her cell phone, dials Tibet, and gets on the phone with a Tibetan woman who had been a guide for the National Committee, and she had a half-hour conversation with her in Chinese, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. Then at the end of it, she said, and my friends are coming over, and I want you to see them. And of course, we went to Tibet, courtesy of Jan, and who arranged the whole trip and the people who were there. Jan, I don't know, you can be very difficult at times. And I've seen you during your difficult periods, but they're so overshadowed by your charm, your wit, your great demeanor, and your warm smile and laugh. We can forgive you for everything. So happy birthday.
Hi, Jan. I'm Jay Henderson. Was a protector. Jan is a mentor. I think that was mentioned earlier tonight. And we always wanted we always strive to be more like Jan. Of course, Jan liked that. You know, she was very eager for us to become more like her. So that was good. But you know, a couple of things about the way that Jan is organized. Someone said something about you know, the stacks of paper that she has around her office. If you look at it very carefully, I would say we on the staff says she has a very sophisticated piling system. She's very decisive. Her commands are very clear-cut as long as they last. She is always very, very eager to, well, to tell us at least 5 minutes in advance what it is that we have to do. And I'm talking about when you're arranging a dinner for 600 people and suddenly at the last minute we have to rearrange 590 of them.
One is, you know, we have created this Jan Barris Program Fund. And if you feel so moved, please leave the card. It sounds like, Jan, it sounds like the Colnidre appeal. But really, it is important. I think it's a wonderful way you know, to honor what has been an incredible 40 years and what's going to be an incredible next 40 years. So, you know, I think all that's left is to just join me in giving Jan the ovation that she deserves.
Well, I wrote something out, but as my friend Peggy Blumenthal said, you probably will be crying too hard to read it, and you should just get up there and say thank you to everyone for coming. So I'm torn what to do, because I know this little thing, clock here says 6:20, and we were supposed to have ended this at 6 o'clock. So I am not going to read this speech. I can read it for the cameras if we want to put it on the video.
Now you get the extra time. You can read it. Presidential decision.
I'm embarrassed because you have all been so funny and so clever and saying things. I have to tell you, I can't write that book anymore because half the things people said, all these wonderful stories, I don't have any recollection. But I trust you enough to know you're not making them up. There's a little glimmer there, but I'm not so sure. So I just say that when, in 1971, I thought that I would be taking a year's leave of absence from the Foreign Service to join the National Committee, and lo and behold, 40 years later, I'm still here. I was in Detroit at the time. Dick Solomon and Alex Eckstein, my two teachers, and Dick, he didn't tell you half of it. I wasn't only his babysitter, but I was the dishwasher, I was the car driver, I was the chauffeur. He once said, Jan, I need to go to the airport. Will you drive me? I said, fine. He forgot to tell me that he drove a stick shift, which I had never driven in my life. So I drive with him to the airport. He gives me 2.5 seconds on how to drive a stick shift, and he gets off to get on the plane. Trouble was, I had to go into reverse, and he forgot to tell me all those little special things you need to know about driving in reverse. So it took me a half an hour to get out of the parking space. I wasn't really sure I wanted to come to the National Committee. I was supposed to go off to Surabaya, Indonesia. Probably 90% of the people in this room haven't even heard of Surabaya. Those who lived through World War II know Surabaya Johnny, but otherwise you don't. When I had never heard of Surabaya when I was told I was going to go there, so I asked what was attractive about it. They said, oh, the dragons at the Komodo dragons at the zoo, which sounded lovely. But it did have two good things to it. It was like 5 minutes away from Bali, which I had fallen in love with the year before, and I had played in the gamelan at the University of Michigan, and I knew if I went there I could play the gamelan to my heart's delight. The only problem was I wasn't quite sure how I was going to find a Jewish doctor or lawyer to marry in Surabaya. So when Alex called and told me that they wanted me to come to New York, he said that the streets of New York are paved with Jewish doctors and lawyers. I thought, well, maybe I'll try it. And he was right, they are, but for all the good it did me, I might as well go to Surabaya. So I came to New York for an interview, and Doug was the person who interviewed me. And after meeting Doug and the rest of the terrific crew at the committee, I decided that I would come and take the job here. It was also helped by Win Lord, and I had written down Kissinger's, but then I realized, where's Win, that it should be Kissinger and Win Lord's secret trip to China, which made people in the Foreign Service say to me, oh yes, go to New York, we'll save your job if you really hate it, you can always come back. But as you can see, I certainly didn't hate it. I started what has been an absolutely fantastic job, and one couldn't have been better if I'd sat down and designed it myself. Somewhere around the 15th year or so, people began saying, how can you be at the same job for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years? When they first started asking me, the answer was easy, and it's still easy 40 years later, because actually, I've been very pleased to see that as a theme, other than Jan's, it's not peccadillos, Peggy, what is it, peculiarities, there's one constant in this, and that is my love for and appreciation, my love for people, and that is what has really kept me at the committee for all these years. While it's exciting to have been in the forefront and cutting relationship, it's fascinating to witness extraordinary changes that have gone on in China. It's wonderful to be part of a committee that plays such a very important role in U.S.-China relations. But for me, that's all well and good and wonderful, but for me, it's the people that I get to meet and to know and to work with. It's the people that I travel to China with, or the Chinese who come to this country, who not only are curious about each other's cultures, but also endure the forced marches that you've heard that I put them through. It's the National Committee member and friends who I call, as you've heard, at all hours of the night and day and weekends, who are always, despite the fact that I'm waking them up out of sound sleep, usually very generous and very willing to accept whatever request I have, whether it's for a meal or to host a delegation at their weekend cottage or even to fund a program. It's the China specialists whose books I read at Michigan and couldn't believe when I came to the National Committee that I was actually not only in the same room with these people, but calling them by their first names. When I used to work for Dick, I had a terrible problem. I was a graduate student, he was this professor, and I called his house, and I was always frightened. I wish it had been in Dick's house like it was in your house, Nick. I wish Carol had always answered the phone then, because if it was, when they answered, when Carol and I say, is your husband there? But when he answered, he had told me to call him Dick, and I was so uncomfortable doing that, and I just had to go, blah. I couldn't say Professor Solomon, and I couldn't say Dick, and it was, so I dreaded calling and having him answer the phone. Anyway, it's those Chinese specialists who were such a wonderful, wonderful series of generations who were my seniors and then my counterparts, and now the younger generation of China scholars that I'm getting to know through the PIP program that Ezra mentioned. And I have to say as well, that was partially my nostalgia that came up with that idea. It was also John who contributed a lot to that too. I got credit. I got a lot of blame during the last hour or so, but I also got credit for things today that really were not totally mine, or some even not mine at all. It's a lot of the people in this room and up on this stage who deserve equally as much credit as I for many things that were said tonight. It's the board members who give so much of themselves, and especially our chairs, from our initial peripatetic Bob Scalapino to our indefatigable Carla Hills, who is currently our chairman. And it's the extraordinarily dedicated, creative, and motivated National Committee staff that I've been blessed to work with over 40 years, and with whom, and some of whom have become my closest friends. and all of whom have made it a pleasure going into work every day. They're all way too numerous to name, but I do want to mention one. Is Roz in the room? Roz. Well, Roz may not be in the room, but I just want to tell you that as my fellow vice president, like me, Roz has been at the committee for a long time. I may have been here for 4 decades, but Roz has been here for 3 decades. And while the staff here is Roz. Well, you'll have to clap for her afterwards. But while most of the all of the program staff get to go out, and we're sort of the public face of the committee, and we get all the honor and glory. But it's Roz and the people who do the administrative work, who sit back at home in the office and don't get all the public credit, who deserve as much of that credit as we do. Over the years, in addition to being asked how I can be at the National Committee for so long, I also get asked a lot, how can you stay at the committee in the job of vice president for so long? Don't you really want to be the president? Again, the answer is easy. It's as easy as the first question. And that is, first of all, that I know my own strengths and I know my own weaknesses. And I want to assure you that I am much better at being a vice president than I would ever be as a president. Second is the fact that I've been blessed with an incredibly wonderful, supported, talented, funny, warm, generous series of presidents. We'll count Press Schroyer in that group, Doug, but Press, Doug Murray, Art Rosen, Mike Lampton, John Holden, and now Steve Orleans. You just cannot, if they all hadn't been as wonderful as they are and as willing to put up with my peculiarities as they have been, and as patient. I'm really surprised. I thought Steve was going to come out with a couple of things about how I go into Steve and ask him about something and he says no, and then 30 minutes later I'm back again asking him for the same thing, and 5 days later, but he very patiently puts up with it all the time. When each one of them, Steve, this isn't for you, Steve, it's all the others. When each one of them is left, I've gone into a major funk, certain that we're never going to be able to find anybody as wonderful or outstanding as the person who just departed. So Steve, I don't think we can do it as many times, so you just really have to stay at least as long as I'm around. There's one other group of people that I have to, so all of this has been about the people that have been so important. And for me, my family have been another group of people who've just supported and sustained me over the years. They've always not only been totally supportive of my work, they've participated in it. You might not have been able to tell, but some of the pictures up here, in fact, that one actually is on a trip to China with my family. That's out of a Hangzhou window that we were told, my brother Billy sent me up there because he was told it was ladies of the night who would beckon people up from that room, and he made me go beckon. But when the ping pong team arrived in Detroit, which was its first stop, and I'm from Detroit, my mother and my grandmother, my whole family was there, part of the welcoming team. My mother and father came to join delegations, the acrobats in Chicago, and the ping pong team in New York, and the tennis team in Vermont. Hank Levine was one of our interpreters for that. And I could go on and on about other times when my dad drove a Chinese delegation in order to save money because we didn't want to pay for a van and a driver. My dad drove a group of university presidents all around the state of Michigan. My mother, after my dad died, my mother and stepfather would have delegations to their houses, etc. And my brothers who've always been there to not just support me, moral support and otherwise, but also to not ridicule, that's not the right word, but show me where I might be off the beaten track on certain things. Still has that wonderful optimism, and I hope you have a chance to get to talk to her. I want to thank everybody who have made this such a wonderful and memorable event. Those who thought of it in the first place, I'm not sure who that was, but thank you. Those who put such long hours into bringing it to fruition, I do know who you are. It's the current staff, and I thank all of you very deeply. And also those of you who are clever enough to figure out a way to make money off of this. I had no idea that this fund was being set up in my name, and I am deeply honored by it and appreciate it, and thank you for it. I've really been very deeply moved and touched by the lovely and funny things people have had to say this afternoon, by some of the beautiful letters that I've gotten over the past couple weeks. I am very touched by so many people who have come, many from far away, John from across the ocean. I'm touched by friends. I have some childhood friends who are all sitting over in that corner of the room. I have who went to junior high. Actually, the song about I'm Just a Girl Who Can't Say No, actually, I didn't realize this, but the boy who I was singing that to is, when we were 12, 13 years old, is sitting over there in the corner, and he's now an Orthodox rabbi, so the difference.
I said no.
He wasn't saying no in those days.